I was at my kitchen table in Watersmeet on a Wednesday morning in August of 2017 when my understanding of what I'd spent 33 years doing in the Ottawa National Forest got turned inside out. The trail camera card had been sitting on my desk for 2 weeks. I'd been putting off pulling it because moose survey season runs August through October, and I had 4 other cards to process and a backlog of incident reports that never fully cleared. I finally put it in the reader around 8 in the morning, poured a cup of coffee from the pot Karen had left on the burner before she headed to school, and started clicking through images the way you do after a year of card time. Deer, bear, deer, deer. Raccoon, empty frame with a moth crossing the field. Deer, otter, and then I stopped clicking. My hand stayed on the trackpad, and I could not breathe right for nearly a full minute. It was a night image, infrared, so everything came out in that washed-out gray-white, the way the world looks through a night vision lens. Every surface either bright or dark, with nothing between. The camera was pointed at a mineral lick on the south bank of a beaver pond in the interior of the forest, 11 miles off the nearest maintained road, in a section of the Ottawa National Forest that most people have never heard of and would not be able to find without a GPS unit and the patience to sit with poor 2 tracks for a long time. The frame showed the lick in the foreground, the pond behind it, the spruce and birch trees at the edge of the frame dark and still, and standing directly in front of the camera lens, close enough that the top of its head nearly went out of frame. It was something that had no business being photographed in Gogabic County in 2017. I want to be clear that I knew what I was looking at immediately. I had been a law enforcement officer with the United States Forest Service for 33 years at that point, and I had done field work in the Ottawa National Forest since 1984, and I knew every species that lives in the western Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The thing in that image was not any of them. But that is not what stopped my breathing. What stopped it was the left forearm. The figure was standing with both arms slightly forward, relaxed at the sides, the way you stand when you are letting something see you, and on the inner surface of the left forearm, in the gray-white of the infrared, I could see a narrow band of pale scar tissue running diagonally across the skin. A cable mark, about 3 inches long. I knew that scar. I had been in the clearing the morning it was made, 29 years before, and what I did that morning was either the right thing or the wrong thing, depending on who was asking, and I have never for 1 second been uncertain about which it was. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Daniel Prater. I was born in Bessemer, Michigan in 1957, the middle child of a miner and a lunch counter waitress, and I grew up at the western end of Gogabic County in a house on a gravel road where the timber started at the back fence and went north without interruption until it ran into Lake Superior. Bessemer is on US 2, close enough to the Wisconsin border that a 10-minute drive puts you across it, and in 1957, it was still primarily an iron mining town, the Gogabic Iron Range having given the county its identity and its economy for the better part of 80 years. My father worked the Carey mine until the ore grade dropped in the late 60s and then found work at the county highway department. My mother ran the lunch counter at Koski's Hardware until it closed. We were not poor, but we were specific. The way people are specific when there is not much cushion between income and need, and the woods were where I went when the house got small. I knew the forest around Bessemer the way a kid knows a backyard. Not all of it. The Ottawa National Forest alone covers close to 1 million acres of mixed hardwood and boreal conifer in the western Upper Peninsula, but the local section, the drainages within 10 miles of town, the trails the deer used in November, and the hunting camps that had been there since before my father was born, and the beaver ponds you could reach by following the creek upstream long enough. By the time I was 14, I was spending full weekends alone in that timber, camping without a tent because the weight savings mattered when you were carrying everything on your back, eating what I caught and what I brought, coming back to town on Sunday with the bone tiredness and mental quiet of someone who has been completely alone in a working forest for 60 hours. That feeling was not something I could explain to anyone who had not had it. I stopped trying early and just went back to the woods whenever I could. I went to Michigan Tech in Houghton in the fall of '75 on an academic scholarship. Tech is at the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula, which pushes up into Lake Superior from the Upper Peninsula, and in January, the combination of lake-effect snow and superior wind makes Houghton County weather that is not a gradation of cold, but a category of it, something you negotiate with rather than simply endure. I studied natural resources and graduated in '79 with enough practical field experience from Tech's program to be immediately useful rather than theoretical. The 4 years after graduation I spent with the Michigan DNR doing wildlife surveys in the central Upper Peninsula, including the Hiawatha National Forest and the Sinney Wildlife Refuge area, doing population assessments for deer and bear and wolf, counting tracks and reading sign and learning the language of a forest, the way you learn any language, badly at first and then not, until one day you realize you are thinking in it rather than translating. The USFS position in Watersmeet opened in the fall of '83. Law enforcement officer, Watersmeet Ranger District, Ottawa National Forest.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the BIGFOOT Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
I applied the week the posting went up, and I started in January of '84, stationed out of the Watersmeet office on US 2, a 2-room building behind the ranger station with a parking area for 3 vehicles and a storage shed that held the snowmobile equipment and the evidence lockers. My district covered the southwestern section of the Ottawa, approximately 600 square miles of federal land running from the Cisco chain of lakes in the east to the Wisconsin border in the west, and from US 2 in the north to the Presque Isle River corridor and then the south. Mixed forest throughout. Sugar maple, yellow birch, and American beech on the upland ridges, eastern hemlock, and northern white cedar in the creek valleys. White pine and red pine on the glacial outwash plains near the lakes. Black spruce and balsam fir in the boreal transition sections of the interior that got heavier and darker the further north you pushed. 600 square miles is a large territory for one officer. In summer, I covered it by truck on the forest roads and on foot and by canoe where the roads ended. In winter, I used a DNR snowmobile for sections accessible by trail and snowshoes for sections that were not. My nearest backup was a fellow officer stationed out of Bessemer, 25 miles east, and in the sections of the district with no radio coverage. A significant portion of the interior had no coverage, and backup meant driving out to a road and making a call. The work was solitary, and I was suited for it. You spend enough time alone in the forest, and you either find it unbearable or you find it necessary. I had always found it necessary. The wildlife in the district in '84 was recovering. White-tailed deer numbers were strong. Black bear were common in the drainages and swamp edges. Gray wolves had been reestablishing in the Upper Peninsula since the mid-'70s, and by '84, there were small packs operating in the most remote sections of the Ottawa. Their territories still expanding, their numbers still contested by the agencies that were supposed to manage them. Moose were not yet established in my district. The reintroduction program that brought animals from Ontario and Minnesota into the eastern Upper Peninsula happened in '85, and the population spread west slowly, but by the late '80s, there were occasional moose in the Presque Isle corridor, and by the '90s, they were a regular, if uncommon, presence. Fisher and pine marten lived in the deep conifer, otter and beaver in every drainage, ruffed grouse in the alder and aspen edges, loons on the lakes in summer, their call carrying across the water on still evenings, sounding like the forest, making a sound for itself rather than for anything that might be listening. October of 1988 was the 4th year of my career with the Ottawa, and it was the year I came to understand that my knowledge of those 600 square miles was incomplete. Not wrong, exactly. Everything I knew about the Ottawa in '88 was real and accurate and earned, but incomplete in a specific way, a way that was not adjustable by more time or more field work or more careful attention to the standard catalog of what lived in that forest. The snare investigation started in early August with a complaint from a bear hunter named Dale Voss, a local man originally from Iron River but living in Watersmeet by then, who held a legal bearbait permit on a site about 3 miles off Forest Road 169 in the northern section of the Presque Isle drainage. He had come in from town to check his bait and found a cable snare set across a game trail about 50 yards from his site, along a hemlock ridge the deer used as a travel corridor between 2 beaver ponds. The snare had caught a doe at the neck. She had been there long enough that the work was done and the crows had found her. Dale left everything where it was, drove to the road, and came to the Watersmeet station to report it in person, which told me immediately that he was a serious person taking the right approach to what he had found. I went out with Dale that afternoon. The snare was exactly as he had described, heavy aircraft cable, commercial grade, the kind you buy in bulk spools from a hardware supplier. The loop was tied with a lock mechanism I recognized from other illegal operations in the region. Not the factory-made snares ordered from a catalog, but field-tied by someone who knew what they were doing. The cable was anchored to a 12-inch hemlock with a swivel that allowed the snare to move without twisting the cable and breaking the lock. The whole assembly had probably cost $4 in materials in 10 minutes to set. I documented the snare, photographed the site, collected the cable, and placed a Bushnell trail camera on the same game trail pointing at the anchor point. I gave Dale my card and asked him to call if he saw anything at the bait site, suggesting the setter was monitoring the area. He said he would. He did not call. Over the next 6 weeks, I located 9 more snares across a 3-mile corridor running from the Hemlock Ridge south to the edge of the Alder Swamp, where the creek spread out into a beaver complex. The placement pattern was considered each snare on a known game trail, each anchored to a tree substantial enough to hold a whitetail or, in the heavier gauge snares near the pond edges, a black bear. 2 of the heavier snares showed signs of a bear having been in them. The ground disturbed, the cable stretched and retied. No bear. Whatever had been in those had gotten loose or been removed before I arrived. One showed blood on the cable near the loop. I could not identify who was running the operation. The access pattern suggested someone using the 2-track off Forest Road 169 in early morning or late evening, with a vehicle capable of handling rough ground, and someone who knew the Presque Isle corridor well enough to set snares at the right places on trails not marked on any official map. I worked the case through September and got nowhere concrete. I had candidate names, people who came up when I asked around Watersmeet about who knew the southern section of the forest that well, but nothing to take to a citation. In early October, a hunting camp about 8 miles northeast of Watersmeet reported finding snares in a section I had not yet covered. 2 men from Iron River, Gene Hayworth and his son-in-law Ray Tolar, both of whom I knew casually from the district, had found 2 snares on game trails in a hemlock and spruce corridor northeast of their camp. The terrain there was different from what I had been working. Heavier timber, steeper ground, the drainage running into a tributary of the Presque Isle rather than the main river, and access was worse, the 2-track ending 1.5 miles from where the snares were located. Whoever had set those had walked in with their gear. I thanked Haworth and told him I would get out there. October 14th was a Friday. Clear and cold, the overnight temperature had dropped to 23 degrees, and the morning was maybe 32 when I started the truck at 6. The hardwood had peaked and was past peak, most of the maple leaves down, the birch still holding some gold on the upper ridges. The forest open in a way it is not in summer, the long sight lines of approaching November, already showing through the thinning canopy. I wore wool pants, a wool shirt, and a canvas field jacket with a liner, and the rubber-bottomed leather boots I used through October, before the snow made pack boots necessary. I ate oatmeal at 5:30, filled the thermos, and had the truck at the 2-track access point by 6:45. From the access point, I walked in through mixed hardwood, sugar maple, and yellow birch on the uplands, the ground covered in the damp, collapsed leaf layer of mid-October. The smell of it, that specific fall smell of wet maple leaves and cold soil, and the beginning of decomposition that the first hard frost accelerates. The trail descended toward the Hemlock and Cedar Creek bottom, the air getting noticeably colder as I dropped below the ridgeline, the light shifting from the open yellow of the hardwood canopy to the filtered gray of the hemlock stands. Eastern hemlock does not drop its needles. In October, when the hardwood around it is bare, a hemlock stand becomes a wall of dark green, dense enough that the interior goes dim. The light cut to a fraction, the temperature several degrees colder than the surrounding open forest. The creek at the bottom of the slope was narrow, running slowly over a gravel and limestone bed, brown with tannin, the way small creeks in the Upper Peninsula always are in fall, clear but dark, like weak tea. Cedar grew along both banks, roots in the water, branches low enough to scrape my hat as I pushed through. I crossed at a shallow gravel bar where the current was ankle-deep and continued northeast along the far bank, following the terrain upward toward the spruce hemlock section, where Haworth had described finding the snares. The first snare was where he said it would be, on a deer trail through the hemlock about 100 yards up from the creek. Fresh cable. Same construction as the others in the drainage. I documented it, cut the anchor, rolled the cable, and put it in my pack alongside the cable cutters I carried for exactly this work. I continued along the deer trail, which went northeast through the hemlock, and began to rise slightly as it moved away from the creek drainage and toward the spruce ridge above. The forest in the hemlock was quiet the way it gets quiet in October. The songbirds mostly gone, the summer insects done, the canopy thin enough to show patches of sky. The wind that had been out of the northwest all morning, reaching the forest floor in cold gusts that moved the fallen leaves across the ground in slow arcs. A red-breasted nuthatch was working a hemlock trunk about 20 yards off the trail, creeping headfirst down the bark in the way nuthatches do. A pair of black-capped chickadees were somewhere in the spruce ahead of me, moving through the branches with their constant small industry. Then, both birds stopped. The nuthatch froze against the bark. The chickadees went silent in the spruce. I had been walking steadily, and I stopped walking when the birds stopped, because you learn what that means after enough years in these woods. It means a predator, or it means something that every living thing in the area has registered as significant before you did. I stood still and listened. The forest was completely silent. Not October quiet, where the ambient sound of insects is gone, but the wind and an occasional bird and the small movements of squirrels continue. Silent in a fuller way than October accounts for. The nuthatch was frozen on the bark. The chickadees were frozen in the spruce. The wind in the canopy above me was the only sound, and even that seemed muted. And then I smelled it. Cold air does not carry scent the way warm air does. The molecules do not move the same way. A bear you might smell in August from 100 yards can pass within 30 yards in October without your nose knowing it. What I smelled that morning was strong enough to cut through October air at 32 degrees. Strong enough to register clearly above the smell of cedar and hemlock and leaf mold, which are themselves powerful smells. Dense and warm, with a sweetness underneath it that had no reference point in my mental catalog of the Presque Isle drainage. Not bear. I had been smelling bear in this forest for 4 years, and I did not need to think about whether it was bear. Not wolf, which has a sharper quality. Not any domestic or livestock animal. Something alive and large and warm-blooded and close enough for me to smell it in these conditions, which meant it was very close indeed. I heard the breathing before I saw anything. Labored, the sound of a body working hard at the simple act of drawing and expelling air, the rhythm of something that has been fighting for a long time and is running out of capacity to fight. It was coming from the spruce ahead and to my left, behind a dense screen of lower branches that blocked the view at about 15 feet. I moved off the deer trail, picking each step carefully on the fallen needles, and came around the edge of the spruce screen into a small natural clearing, maybe 20 feet across, where a large hemlock stood at the far end, with its root flare spreading into the forest floor. I stopped. What was in that clearing took me 3 full seconds to process, and in those 3 seconds my mind ran through every category it had and came up short on all of them. Up against the base of the hemlock, with its back to the trunk and its left arm extended outward, sat something I had no category for. The arm was extended because it had no choice. A cable snare, heavier gauge than the deer snares, the kind a person would set for black bear, was around the wrist, and the cable ran from the wrist across the clearing floor to a swivel bolt anchored in the hemlock trunk, held taut because whatever was in it had spent a considerable time pulling against it. The ground between the hemlock and a spruce 5 yards away was torn up. A 4-inch sapling lay uprooted and flat. The bark on the hemlock trunk at about shoulder height was gouged in 2 long parallel marks that showed white wood through the gray bark. Whatever had been in that cable had fought to free itself with everything it had for a long time, and had not succeeded. What was in the cable now was resting. The chest and shoulders moved with each labored breath. The body sat in the posture of something that has spent its reserves and is conserving what remains. The hair was dark, near black on the back and shoulders, the hair there dense and several inches long, with a warm, deep brown showing on the upper arms and chest where the density thinned and the skin beneath showed through, a gray-brown like the underside of hemlock bark aged by weather. The arms were long, longer than any proportion I could immediately reference, the right arm resting across the raised knee, the left arm held outward by the cable's tension. The right hand, resting on the knee, had the shape and proportions of a hand. 4 fingers and a thumb, the knuckles ridged, the nails flat and broad, the creasing at the joints, the creasing of a hand that has done physical work, but scaled to a degree that made my field understanding of animal size briefly fail me entirely. The face was turned toward me. It took me a moment longer to look at the face than it should have. My attention had been on the arm and the cable and the hands, and the immediate physical inventory of the situation, which is a trained reaction. Assess what you have, identify the components, understand the variables before you make a decision. I did all of that, and then I looked at the face. The brow ridge was pronounced, the forehead sloping back from it at an angle that was not human, but was not the flat angle of a bear's skull either. The cheekbones were wide and heavy. The nose was broad across the bridge, with large nostrils that moved slightly with each breath. The mouth was closed, the jaw heavy, the lips thin. The eyes were set deep under the brow ridge, shadowed by it, but not shadowed enough to hide the color, dark brown as hemlock bark after rain, or to conceal the quality of what was in them. The eyes were looking at me with the specific awareness of something that knew what I was, what I carried, and what I might do, and had made a calculation about what was likely to happen next, not animal panic, not the blank stare of shock, a watching, a waiting, the eyes of something that was in pain and exhausted and caught and was nonetheless thinking clearly about its situation and about the person standing 20 feet away from it holding a badge and a sidearm. My hand was on the .40 caliber Smith on my hip. I had not drawn it. I do not think I decided not to draw it. The decision had already been made somewhere below the level of conscious decision-making, in the part of a person that responds to what it sees in another pair of eyes before the brain has finished processing what kind of eyes they are. What I saw in those eyes did not require a drawn weapon. What I saw in those eyes required a pair of cable cutters. I crouched down slowly, made myself smaller, kept both hands visible. I moved my hand away from the sidearm. The cable cutters were in the front pocket of my pack, and I reached back and unzipped the pocket carefully, watching the face the whole time, and pulled the cutters out and held them up with both handles visible, blades facing away. Here is the thing that can fix what is wrong with your arm. The face watched me. The labored breathing continued. A long stretch of seconds passed in which nothing changed. I could feel my pulse in my temples and in my hands. Then the left arm moved. The held arm extended by a fraction of an inch, a small and entirely controlled outward shift, presenting the wrist and the cable to the person holding the cable cutters. It was the motion of a being that has assessed the situation and made a decision about the person in front of it. I crossed the clearing, 15 steps, crouching, moving laterally to approach the anchor point on the hemlock trunk rather than the wrist directly. This put me at the tree rather than within arm's reach of the being in the cable. My hands were steady. I do not know exactly why they were steady. The cable was anchored to a swivel bolt set in the hemlock wood at about chest height, and the cable ran from the swivel to the loop around the wrist, and I got the jaws of the cable cutters around the cable between the swivel and the loop, and I squeezed. The cable parted with a sharp metallic snap, the two cut ends recoiling in opposite directions, and the tension went out of the system. The cable around the wrist went slack. I stepped back. 3 steps, quickly, putting the width of the clearing between us. The wrist came up. The right hand came across and worked at the slack loop, pulling it over the hand with careful, patient fingers that knew exactly what they were doing. The cable fell into the leaf litter. The freed wrist was brought close to the face and examined. I could see the cable mark clearly from across the clearing, a ring of damaged tissue where the wire had cut in during the fighting, the skin abraded and open in a diagonal line, the surrounding area beginning to swell. The wound was real. It would take time to close. It would scar. Then the figure stood. The act of standing from a seated position took 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds the scale of the clearing changed completely. What had been very large seated became a different order of large upright. The top of the head cleared the first hemlock branches, which I would measure the following spring at 9 feet 2 inches off the ground, by several inches. The shoulders at full height were at a level that reordered every spatial relationship in the clearing. The hemlock trunk that had seemed a substantial reference point was now narrower than the being standing in front of it. The hair on the shoulders and back was dense and near black, moving slightly in the cold air where it was longest. The chest and upper arms showed the lighter-colored hair, the skin beneath visible in patches, that same deep gray-brown. The arms hung at the sides. The freed left wrist held a fraction away from the body, favoring the injury. The face looked at me. We were 20 feet apart. The chickadees in the spruce had gone quiet again. The October air sat cold and still in the clearing. The only sound was the distant drip of snowmelt from a branch somewhere above, which had been dripping all morning and which I had not noticed until now because everything else had stopped. The expression on the face at that moment is something I have spent 36 years trying to name accurately, because the word I reach for is never quite right. What was there was not gratitude in any simple sense. It was not softness. It was closer to acknowledgement, the look of a being that has just received something specific and knows it and intends to carry it. The watching that had been there since I walked into the clearing, the weighing of what I was and what I might do, had resolved into something settled, a conclusion reached. The brown eyes held mine for perhaps 5 seconds. Then the figure turned, unhurried, taking no more urgency in leaving than it had shown in staying, and took a step north toward the spruce, and another step, and then the trees took it in the way a lake takes in a stone, completely, without remainder, without sound. 1 second, it was there. 1 second later, there was only hemlock and spruce, and the October air, and the churned ground, and the cable in the leaf litter, and my own breathing, which was the loudest thing left in the clearing. I stood there for a while, longer than I needed to from any practical standpoint. The nuthatch came back to the hemlock trunk behind me, and resumed its creeping descent of the bark. The chickadees moved through the spruce to the north, and then went quiet again, and then came back, the way birds do when a large presence has moved through, and they are deciding whether it is safe to resume normal business. The musk in the air was strong. The October afternoon light was coming at a low angle through the bare hardwood above, and coloring the clearing gold, the specific low gold of a clear October afternoon in the Upper Peninsula, which is a color that has nothing tentative in it. I picked up the 2 pieces of cut cable from the leaf litter, the swivel end and the longer piece that had connected the swivel to the loop. I put both in my pack alongside the other snare cable I had collected that morning. Then I walked out of the clearing, back along the deer trail, back through the hemlock, back across the creek, back up through the hardwood, back to the truck. The drive back to Watersmeet took 40 minutes. The heater ran the whole way, and I was still cold when I parked at the district office. My supervisor, a district ranger named Norm Haskins, who had been with the Ottawa for 20 years and who kept a jar of peppermints on his desk that he offered to everyone who came in, was at his desk when I sat down across from him. I told him about the snares in the hemlock corridor northeast of the Haworth camp, the cable construction, the anchor method, the game trail placement. I told him about the heavy gauge snare that showed signs of a large animal having been in it and gotten loose. When I wrote the official field report that evening at my desk, I wrote that the snare had activated, likely catching a black bear, and that the bear had worked its way free. The disturbed ground, the uprooted sapling, the bark gouges on the hemlock, consistent with a large animal fighting against a fixed anchor point. I did not write what animal. I have been over that decision many times in the years since, not doubting it, but wanting to understand it precisely, because the why matters as much as the what. I was a law enforcement officer with institutional obligations and a signed oath. I had every professional reason to report accurately and completely. I sat in my truck in that parking lot, and I calculated that my obligations as a law enforcement officer and my obligation as the person who had just shared that hemlock clearing did not point in the same direction, and I chose the one that was not official. The reason was the eyes. Specifically, what I had seen in those eyes from the first moment I saw that face to the last moment before the figure turned and walked into the spruce. There was no institutional framework for what I had seen. No system existed that could have preserved it. Institutions respond to things by imposing categories on them, and the category that would have been imposed on that clearing and that cable and that being would have ended the thing it was before it was found. I believed that then, and I believe it now. So I wrote bear in the field report, and I went home. Karen was at the kitchen table when I came in. We had been living together since '86, not yet married. That came in '91. And she knew my face in the way a person knows the face of someone they have been watching closely for 2 years. As a woman who grew up in the Upper Peninsula reads the face of someone who has had a genuine experience in the woods rather than a routine one. She looked at me when I came through the door and she said, "What happened?" I sat down at the table and I told her. The drive out, the woods, the hemlock drainage, what I found in the clearing, and what I did about it. I was at the table for about 45 minutes. The coffee she made me went cold while I talked. When I finished, she sat across from me for a while, her hands around her own cup, looking at the table. Then she said, "Did it try to hurt you?" "No." "Did it threaten you at any point?" "No." "Then you did right," she said. "Write whatever you need to write and don't say another word about it." That was the whole conversation. We ate dinner, we watched the news, I went to bed and I slept, which surprised me. I started a private field notebook that week. Not my official field notes, which I kept exactly as I always had, but a separate composition book that I bought at the hardware store in Watersmeet and kept at home in my desk drawer. On the first page, I wrote the date, October 14th, 1988, and the location. And I wrote down everything I could remember about the hemlock clearing in as much detail as I could hold. The smell, the size, the hair, the face, the cable mark on the wrist after it was freed, the way the arm had extended to present the cable for cutting. I wrote it the way I wrote field notes, which is to say clinically and specifically, because the clinical and specific form is the form that holds up over years, that you can read a decade later and still trust. In November, I returned to the Presque Isle drainage, 6 weeks after the hemlock clearing, not to the clearing itself. The terrain was harder to move through with the deer trails, less distinct, and the hemlock section was darker in November than it had been in October, the sky mostly closed overhead. I worked southeast of the clearing, along the creek drainage, moving carefully, and in a patch of soft ground at a creek bend I found the first track. It was in mud that had not yet frozen, a south-facing bank that got enough afternoon sun to stay soft into November. The track was a foot, 5 toes, a broad ball, a heel, the arch visible in the deep impression. The length was 17 inches. The width across the ball was 8 inches. I wore a size 10 boot and left a track in that same mud that measured about 11.5 inches long and 4 inches wide, at a depth of roughly half an inch. This track was over 2 inches deep. I photographed it with the camera in my field pack. I photographed the stride. There was a second track, 4 feet 8 inches ahead of the first, a third beyond that. I photographed the direction of travel, which was northeast, toward the spruce. Then I put the camera back in the pack, and I did not submit those photographs to any official record. They went into the desk drawer at home, in an envelope with the date written on it, and the private notebook got a new entry. I went back to the Presque Isle drainage 3 more times before the snow made access impossible, and found nothing further. In the spring of '89, after breakup, I hiked back to the hemlock clearing and found the cable anchor still on the hemlock trunk, the swivel rusting at the attachment point, the ground around it beginning to heal. The uprooted sapling was already pushing new growth from the root base. No tracks, no musk. The clearing was just a clearing in the hemlock. The first winter told me something I needed to know. In January of '89, on a patrol day when the temperature had dropped to 8 below zero overnight, and the forest was holding the particular silence that deep cold brings to the interior, I went in on snowshoes through the Presque Isle drainage. The hemlock clearing was under 2 feet of snow, the cable anchor visible on the trunk, the cut end hanging frozen. Nothing had entered the clearing since the first snow of November. On the way back toward Forest Road 169, I stopped at the creek, crossing 50 yards upstream from where I had found the first track the previous October. The creek was running dark beneath an ice shelf that extended from both banks toward the center current, and in the snow at the edge of the ice on the upstream side, there was a track. Single track, ball, and 4 toes, the width I had measured in October. The snow had crusted hard from a freeze and thaw cycle the week before, and it would have held me without leaving a mark. It had not held this. I stood at the creek for a long time. The cold was past the point where you feel it specifically, and into the range where the body simply reports that conditions are serious. I photographed the track from 4 angles and measured the dimensions and the depth and the stride length in the direction of travel before I walked out. That evening, I opened the private notebook and wrote down what the January drainage had confirmed. It was still there. But I went back. I kept going back, through the 90s and into the 2000s, because a decade and a half of field work in that drainage had taught me that absence of sign in a specific visit did not mean absence from the territory. It meant the territory was large. In the summer of 1990, I found the first structure in the spruce section north of the hemlock clearing, a quarter mile from where the figure had disappeared into the trees. 3 young spruces, each about 4 inches in diameter, had been bent at about 7 feet off the ground and woven together at their upper sections to form a rough overhead lattice. The bending was in smooth arcs, the wood fibers intact but stressed under continuous lateral pressure applied in a chosen direction. I had been in the forest for 6 years at that point, and I had seen a great deal of wind damage and snow loading and beaver work and bear sign, and I had never seen anything that looked like that. Wind damage produces random angles and broken fibers. Snow loading produces downward deformation. This was lateral, controlled, the bends uniform and the angle chosen by something that knew what result it was working toward. I documented the structure in the private notebook and left it alone. In the spring of '92, I found a partial track in the same creek bend mud where I had found the first one in '88. In the summer of '94, I found a second structure in the spruce thicket, larger than the first, with bends at 12 feet off the ground on the biggest trees, the interior compacted into a flat space about 20 feet across where the duff had been pressed down and was stained, smelling organic and familiar. In the fall of '96, I found a bark rub on a yellow birch at a height of 11 feet, the bark removed cleanly rather than torn or shredded the way a bear rubs, in a location that made no behavioral sense for a bear to be rubbing. The bark rub was at a height that a bear does not reach. It had the quality of marking, of something left at a specific height for a specific purpose. The winter of '97 settled something I had not admitted to carrying. By then I had been holding the private record for 9 years, and the intervals between clear sign were long enough that a quiet uncertainty had become a companion on those patrols. Not doubt about what had happened in the hemlock clearing, but the kind that asks whether the territory is still occupied, or whether a person who has been looking for 9 years is cataloging the residue of something that moved on long before. In January, I snowshoed into the Presque Isle drainage and found, in the hemlock thicket east of the main channel, a section of forest floor that had been cleared of snow in an area roughly 15 feet across. The snow had been moved to the margins in low, consistent ridges that no wind would have organized in that pattern. The musk was present, faint, as deep cold reduces scent to its minimum, but present and specific and unchanged after 9 years, the way certain smells anchor themselves when the original encounter happened under conditions of absolute attention. The doubt that had been a companion on 9 years of patrols was considerably quieter on the walk back to the truck. I cataloged all of it in the private notebook. I submitted none of it through any official channel. The last sign I found in the Presque Isle drainage was in October of 2003, a partial track at the creek bend, the ball and first 3 toes only, but clear enough to measure and photograph. 15 years after the hemlock clearing, in the same drainage, in the same section, after 2003, nothing. Not a track, not a structure, not a bark rub, not the musk on any of my patrols through the area. The drainage continued to show normal wildlife activity, deer, bear, the occasional moose, otter in the creek, but the specific sign I had been cataloging for 15 years was absent. The patrols continued through those years. The drainage did not change in any material way I could identify. The creek ran as it always had. The hemlock thicket was intact. The mineral lick on the beaver pond was active in all seasons, used by deer and bear and the moose that were now established in the district. I went back in every season for 11 more years after 2003, and the private notebook that had grown through 15 years of entries sat without a new one. It is a specific kind of difficulty to maintain certainty across that length of absence, to hold on to what you know happened in the hemlock clearing in '88, while the drainage produced nothing further to support it for a decade and then a decade more. By 2014, I had spent 30 years as a Watersmeet district ranger and had held this record alone, except for Karen, who had never asked me whether I still believed it, which was its own form of belief. The honest accounting, in 2014, was that I did not know whether it was still there. I had kept looking because I had no reason to stop. I adjusted my assumption rather than replacing it. The territory had shifted, or the habits had changed, or I was looking in the wrong places, or all three. The Ottawa National Forest is a large forest, and a cautious intelligence living in it would not require me to find its sign every season to remain in the forest. I had been searching a specific drainage in a specific way for 15 years. That was my limitation, not the forest's. If any of you have spent time in the Ottawa National Forest, particularly in that southwestern corner around Gogebic County and the Presque Isle River drainage, and you've come back from a walk with something you couldn't explain, I would genuinely like to hear it. The deep interior of that forest is not a place most people reach, but some of you have. Drop it in the comments. The Moose Survey Camera Program began in the fall of 2015. The Ottawa had been coordinating with Michigan DNR on moose population monitoring since the mid-90s. The Upper Peninsula moose population, established by the '85 reintroduction, had grown slowly in the western districts before beginning to level off, and the long-term picture required establishing where moose were using the forest and in what numbers through the year. By 2015, the GPS technology and remote camera equipment had advanced enough to make a multi-camera grid in genuinely remote terrain practical and cost-effective. I proposed 12 camera stations in the most remote sections of my district, positioned at mineral licks, active beaver ponds, and creek crossings with consistent moose sign in the surrounding area. One of those stations was in the Presque Isle drainage. I want to be clear about my reasoning. The beaver pond I chose as the camera site had an active mineral lick on its south bank with moose tracks from the previous winter survey, and positioning a camera there was sound wildlife monitoring practice regardless of anything else. The fact that it was in the same drainage where I had spent 15 years watching for other sign was not the primary reason the camera went there. But I would be dishonest if I said the location was entirely coincidental, and honesty has been the standard I have held to in this account. The camera was a Reconix HC600, a professional-grade unit built for remote deployment. The HC600 has a fast trigger, reliable infrared capability for night imaging, and a battery life that makes 6-month to 12-month deployments practical. I bolted the unit to a yellow birch about 15 feet back from the mineral lick, at chest height, angled to cover the lick and the near bank of the pond. I programmed it for 24-hour operation, 3 images per trigger event, with a 60-second quiet period between events. Standard protocol. I set the camera in late September of 2015 and pulled the card in November. Deer in quantity, 1 black bear, no moose but moose tracks on the bank west of the lick. The camera was working correctly. I reset it and walked out. March of 2016. More deer, 1 moose, a cow, a single image from late February, alone at the lick in the dark. 3 black bears, fresh out of hibernation, appearing in late March, gaunt and moving with the single-minded purpose of animals that have been fasting for 4 months and are now correcting that situation. 2 river otter crossing the bank in April, moving with that fluid, boneless efficiency that makes otter look assembled differently than everything else. No unusual images. I reset the camera. August of 2016. 3 moose through June and July, a bull and 2 cows, both cows apparently with calves based on the behavior visible in the images, good data for the survey. Also, in a set of images from June 17th at 2:14 in the morning, a partial, the left edge of the frame showed a dark form, moving fast through the camera's peripheral range, present in 2 frames, and gone in the 3rd. Whatever had moved through was moving at speed. The portion visible in the left edge of the frame was unclear. I looked at it on my laptop, zoomed to maximum, looked again. Too dark and the wrong shape for a bear moving at that pace, and wrong proportions for a moose. The height of the dark form in relation to the birch trees at the frame's edge was not consistent with any animal I had available to assign it to. I saved those 3 images in a separate folder. I noted the date in the private notebook. Then I repositioned the camera 6 feet to the left on the birch, widening the field of view so that the left margin of the frame would now cover the approach trail the June partial seemed to indicate. I was not certain the partial meant anything. I was not going to claim it as definitive, but I was going to ensure that if anything came along that approach trail again, the camera would have the full frame rather than the edge of it. The card I pulled in August of 2017 had been in the camera since the previous October. 10 months of continuous operation, a full year of the mineral lick and the beaver pond, and whatever moved through the Presque Isle drainage in the dark. I had 4 other camera stations with higher survey priority that month, and I was behind on a pair of poaching cases, and the card sat on my desk for 2 weeks after I pulled it. When I finally put it in the reader at my kitchen table on that Wednesday morning and clicked through 4,000 images, the deer in their dozens, the bears in their comings and goings, the otter pair in April again, the bald eagle that spent 40 minutes working the shallows in June, the bull moose in velvet in July, the 3 cows through the summer. And then I stopped clicking and sat with my hand on the trackpad and could not breathe. Right for nearly a full minute. The timestamp on the image read July 26th, 2017, 11:43 in the evening. The mineral lick was in the center of the frame. The beaver pond was behind it, the infrared making the water surface bright with reflected light. The spruce and birch at the edges of the frame were dark columns against the flat white of an infrared night sky. and standing at the lick, close enough to the camera that the top of its head approached the upper edge of the frame, was a figure that occupied the frame the way a large tree occupies a forest, not a foreground element in a larger scene, but the central fact of the image, the presence that changed the scale of everything else around it, and revealed the actual size of the mineral lick and the width of the pond bank for what they were, rather than what the deer and bear images had made them seem. The figure was standing, fully upright, the spine vertical, not stooped or crouching. The hair on the back and shoulders was near black, dense, the infrared catching the texture of it so that individual strands were visible where the light hit at the right angles. On the chest and upper arms, the hair was lighter, and through it the gray-brown of skin showed in patches. The face was turned directly toward the camera. Not a glance caught mid-movement, not a profile in passing. A face pointed at the lens with a stillness that was not the stillness of an animal frozen by an unexpected light. The stillness of something that has decided to stand in a specific place and be seen by a specific person. The brow ridge was heavier than I remembered from '88, the jaw more defined, the silver at the temples more pronounced, running through the near black hair in broad bands now, rather than the lighter framing I had seen in the hemlock clearing. The face was older. I acknowledge that comparing a single infrared image across 29 years of memory is not the same thing as a reliable identification. I acknowledge that, and I'm telling you anyway that I looked at that face, and I recognized it the way you recognize a face. You spent a significant portion of a specific morning memorizing in a specific clearing on October 14th of 1988, and the recognition was not a wish. It was a certainty. But the face was not what confirmed it without argument. The figure was standing with both arms slightly forward, relaxed at the sides. The left arm was angled so that the inner forearm was visible to the camera, and across the inner surface of that forearm, clear in the gray-white of the infrared, was a narrow pale line running diagonally from just above the wrist toward the inner forearm. Scar tissue. Pale against the surrounding hair because healed, scar tissue does not produce the same hair density as the surrounding skin. 3 inches long, running at the same diagonal angle, a cable would make around a wrist if the wrist were held outward and slightly raised, the way an arm held by a taut anchor snare would be positioned. The cable mark on the left wrist that I had last seen in a hemlock clearing on October 14th of 1988 from 20 feet away, while my hands were on the cable cutters. I know that scar. I made the cut that ended the cable that caused that scar. I sat at my kitchen table, and I looked at the image for a long time. Then I clicked to the next frame, 2 seconds later by the timestamp. The figure was still there, facing the camera, unchanged in position. Frame 3, 6 seconds after the first. The lick was empty. The pond bank was empty. The spruce were just spruce. 3 frames. Based on the trigger pattern and the 60-second quiet period, the camera had captured 46 seconds of presence at that lick. It had stood in front of the camera for 46 seconds and then left. I have looked at a great many wildlife camera images in 38 years of fieldwork, and I want to be precise about what 46 seconds of motionless, camera-facing presence from a non-human subject means in the context of remote wildlife monitoring. Animals at mineral licks stand still when they are eating or drinking. A deer stands motionless for minutes because it is occupied with the lick. A motionless figure, facing the lens, not eating, not drinking, not moving. That is a different category of behavior entirely. That is the stillness of intention. That is something that came to a specific location, faced a specific device, held still long enough to be clearly documented, and left when it chose to. I could not sleep that night. Karen was already in bed when I came to the bedroom doorway, and I stood there for a moment and then went back to my desk and sat with the laptop open on those 3 frames. I studied the left forearm in each one. The scar was consistent across all 3 images. Same position, same angle, same length. Not a shadow, not an artifact. Scar tissue on living skin. I went through the 3 frames one more time before I closed the laptop. In the first frame, he was facing the lens directly, both arms at his sides, the head level, the posture of something that has stopped and is presenting itself rather than passing through. In the second frame, 6 seconds later by the timestamp, the left arm had shifted slightly outward, the forearm more visible. In the third frame, 22 seconds after that, he had turned roughly 15 degrees to his left, not moving away, but angling slightly. As you shift your weight during a long stillness, and the scar on the inner forearm was fully in the infrared light. At 4 in the morning, I went to the desk drawer where I kept the private notebook, and I pulled it out and I wrote in it for about an hour. Everything I had seen in the image, everything the image brought back about the hemlock clearing, everything I was thinking about, the relationship between those two events, and what the 46 seconds at the lick meant, if it meant what I thought it meant. Then I made a decision about what I was going to do the next morning, which was a Thursday, and I went to bed for 2 hours before the alarm went off. What I remember about those 2 hours is that I did not sleep. I lay in the dark and went over what I had seen on the laptop screen alongside what I knew about the forearm I had seen in the hemlock clearing in '88. And I looked carefully for the place where I might be making two separate things into one, because 30 years of private certainty had shaped my reading in a direction it could no longer correct for. This is what a person who has spent their career in fieldwork does with a finding that matters. They look for the places where they might be wrong. The scar angle was specific. Its position on the forearm was specific. The hair color was consistent with what had lightened and grayed across decades of age. The height and the mass were consistent with what a long-lived individual would carry 29 years further on from where I had first seen him. I went over each of those assessments in the dark and could not find a place where the reading failed. I drove to the end of the 2-track in the dark and walked in before sunrise. 4 miles through the hardwood and down into the cedar and hemlock, and then across the creek and northeast to the Presque Isle drainage and the beaver pond. The forest before dawn in August in the Upper Peninsula has a specific quality. The air carries both the residual warmth of the summer night and the mineral chill of the creek, and the darkness under the canopy is denser than outside it, and the sounds are the sounds of a forest finishing its nighttime business before the light changes everything back. I reached the beaver pond as the sky was going from dark to gray over the spruce to the east. Loons calling from the lake half a mile east, their voices crossing the still air with the flat carrying quality that early morning gives to sound in the North Country. I sat on the north bank, away from the camera, and I waited. The first hour was ordinary forest morning. A great blue heron working the shallows at the far end of the pond with the methodical patience that herons have made their identity. A beaver surfacing from the lodge and crossing the pond in a straight line to the inlet alder, the sun coming through the birch to the east and beginning to warm the bank. Black-capped chickadees in the alder. A white-throated sparrow calling from the spruce. That clear 3-note phrase, 2 short and 1 falling long, that is the sound of early morning in the northern forest. Normal and full and entirely itself. At 7:14, the birds in the birch at the water's edge went quiet. The musk came a minute later, faint at first, then stronger, with the same layering of warm and dense and subtly sweet that I had known since October of '88, the same quality that sets it apart from everything else biological in this forest. It was coming from the spruce to the north. I held my face toward the pond, kept my hands on my knees, let my peripheral vision cover the tree line to the north while my direct gaze stayed on the water. Looking too directly at something you are waiting for creates a kind of pressure that a cautious intelligence can register across 30 yards. And I did not want to create pressure. I had not come here with pressure. I had come here with a piece of cable in my jacket pocket and 29 years of kept silence. I heard it come to the bank. A single compression of the soft moss on the north bank, the near silence of something large, moving with genuine care about the sound it was making, and then stillness. I looked up. It was at the edge of the spruce, where the trees met the open bank, about 30 feet north of me. Standing in the August morning light, real light now, not the gray-white of infrared, the full color and depth of an early morning in the Upper Peninsula in late July. And the hair in that light was deep brown, going to near black on the back and shoulders, the silver at the temples visible as broad, distinct streaking, a gray that had spread since '88 through the hair on the sides of the face and the forearms. The face was heavier in the jaw, the brow more pronounced, the lines of it deepened in the way that decades of outdoor exposure and the simple passage of years deepens the lines of any face. But it was the same face. The infrared images had given me the mass and the proportions and the identifying detail of the scar, but they had not given me this, the full physical reality of a real body in real morning light at real distance, as the hair caught the early sun where the canopy opened above the bank and shifted in color from the shoulders to the chest, the deep near-black lightening on the chest and upper arms to a warm brown that the infrared had registered only as gradations of gray, In '88, I had been close enough to smell the warmth coming off him and to feel the reality of what I was standing beside, as the single photograph from that afternoon had never fully carried forward across the decades. 30 years had taken some of what I had known that October afternoon into the category of things that exist only in their recalled version, shaped by the retelling and the time and the accumulated private meaning of the interval. Standing at the bank in the August morning with 30 feet of clear air between us, the reality of him returned in the same complete way it had arrived in the hemlock clearing. Not remembered, present. He was watching me with the same quality of attention I had seen in '88, not the wide alerting scan of a prey species and not the fixed assessment of something identifying a threat, but the directed attention of something reading a known individual for current information. He knew what I was. He was checking whether anything about me had changed. The same proportions, the same brown eyes, looking at me across 30 feet of beaver pond bank with the same quality of knowing what they were looking at and having had time to reach a conclusion about it. The left arm was at its side. The forearm was visible in the morning light. The diagonal scar was clearly there, pale against the surrounding hair, a narrow mark from just above the wrist running inward at the angle the cable had made. We looked at each other across 30 feet. The heron worked the far end of the pond. The beaver returned from the inlet to the lodge, creating a small wake that reached the bank at my feet and spent itself on the moss. The spruce to the north were bright at their tips where the sun was reaching the upper canopy. The August morning continued its business around us, while we held whatever this was between us across 30 feet of open bank, and neither of us moved. Then I reached into the left pocket of my jacket. The 2 pieces of cut cable, the piece from the swivel end and the longer piece from the loop, had been in a desk drawer at home for 29 years. I could not tell you exactly why I had kept them. I had known I would keep them on the walk out of the hemlock clearing, without making a conscious decision about it, and I had brought them home and put them in the drawer, and there they had stayed through all the years and the moves within the house, and the drawers that got cleaned out and the drawers that did not. I placed both pieces on the bank in front of me, the cut ends showing. Then I set my hand flat on the moss next to them, palm down, and I looked up. Across 30 feet, the face processed this. I watched the processing happen, not in any dramatic single motion, but in the eyes and the face there was a shift of the quality that I had been trying to name since I walked into the hemlock clearing 29 years before, the settling of something that had been held in a particular position for a long time, releasing toward a more natural position. I had brought the cable. I had kept it for 29 years. I had brought it back. The right hand came up from the side, slow. The arm extended and the hand opened, palm facing me, the fingers spread and held at that angle. 3 seconds. 4. Then the hand lowered. It turned and went into the spruce with the same unhurried care it had shown in the hemlock clearing, the same absence of urgency in the going, and the spruce closed behind it without a sound. I sat on the bank for a long time. The sun moved. The heron left for the far side of the lake. The beaver was working somewhere in the lodge. The spruce to the north stood in the light the way they always stand in the Ottawa in August, dense and dark and older than whatever human business has been conducted in their shadow. I picked up the 2 pieces of cable and I put them back in my jacket pocket. I went back to the pond 7 more times before I retired in the spring of 2022. It was there on 5 of those visits. Not every visit called for a response. I came to understand. The fact of returning was itself a communication, and a communication does not need to be answered every time to be heard. But 5 of 7 times, the musk would come and the forest would go quiet, and it would be at the bank or in the spruce, or, on one September morning in 2018, on the old logging grade about 200 yards from the pond, standing in the full open on the overgrown roadbed, when I came around a bend in the trail, making no move to step back, watching me approach in the morning light with the ease of something on its own ground that has made up its mind about the person walking toward it. On an October morning in 2020, I sat at the north bank of the pond for 3 hours before the musk came in from the south, and the forest went through that specific shift in quality I had come to recognize as reliable indication. I waited. He came to the bank from the south that morning rather than from the spruce to the north, which was where he had appeared on most of the earlier visits. He stood at the bank for a while and then moved along it toward the inlet stream, following the bank with a measured, unhurried slowness that I had not seen before, and I had the impression, which I cannot support with anything more than the years of attention I had given that territory, that he was moving at a speed that let me stay with him visually through the cover at the bank edge. He stopped at the inlet and looked into the water for a long time. Then he turned south and went into the willows and was gone. I sat at the bank for another hour before I walked out, in the October quiet with the birch turning on the slope above the pond and the creek sound coming from the north. That visit is the last entry in the private notebook. I showed Karen the 3 images from July 26th, 2017, the night after I found them. She sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open, and she looked at each frame for a long time. She did not say anything for a while. Then she pointed at the forearm in the first image and she said, "Is that the scar from the cable?" "Yes." She sat with that for a moment longer. "He came to be seen," she said. I had not said he at any point in describing what I saw. Karen had arrived at the pronoun on her own within 30 seconds of seeing the image, and she was not wrong, and I have used that word ever since. I retired from the Ottawa National Forest in May of 2022, 38 years after I started. My last patrol of the district was a November morning, the hardwood bare, the birch holding the last gold, the sky the pewter gray of late November in the Upper Peninsula, the air carrying the cold that will not fully leave until April. I drove every road in the district one more time. At the 2-track access point for the Presque Isle drainage, I stopped the truck and sat for a while with the window down, the cold air coming in off the forest, the hemlock and spruce dark at the end of the track. Then I put the truck in gear and drove back to Watersmeet. I did not go back into the drainage after I retired, and that was a decision I made on purpose and have kept. The access I had to that section of the forest was built through 38 years of work, through the job that brought me there, and I was not willing to convert it into something I pursued for my own purposes after the work was done. The drainage does not belong to me. It belongs to whatever has been living in it since before I started, and will continue long after whatever trace of my career there has faded into the forest floor. The camera is still in the Presque Isle drainage. My successor at the Ottawa took over the Moose survey program and has been reviewing the cards twice a year. He has mentioned nothing unusual in the images, and I don't know whether that means the camera site is no longer being engaged with the same intention, or whether the images are reviewed quickly with moose in mind and everything that isn't a moose is noted and moved past. I have no standing to ask. The pieces of cable are in the desk drawer at home. The private field notebook, 34 years of entries, from November of '88 to the last visit in October of 2019, sits in the same drawer. I am not doing anything official with either of them. There is nothing to be gained from it, and something that cannot be replaced to be lost, and that calculation was clear to me in a parking lot in Watersmeet in October of '88 and has not changed. Karen and I still live in the house on the east side of Watersmeet. Our son Paul works for Michigan DNR out of Marquette, which did not surprise me. Our daughter Julie teaches 7th grade in Grand Rapids, which suits her in ways the Upper Peninsula would not have. It is a full life. In the evenings, when the light is going, I sometimes sit on the back porch, and the birch at the edge of the property begin to darken as the sky darkens, the white of the bark going gray, and I think about the Ottawa, the way you think about a place where you spent most of your life, without urgency but with something steady at the base of it, warm and not going anywhere. I want to say one thing clearly before I finish. I want to say it for anyone who has spent real time in deep forest, the kind of forest where the roads stop and the timber goes on and the nearest other person is hours away and the only human evidence is what you are making with your own feet. You know what I mean when I say that a forest like that has a texture that goes past what the standard catalog accounts for. Not everywhere, not every visit, but in the remote places, the drainages away from maintained trails and roads, the sections that do not get regular human traffic. There is sometimes a quality to the silence that is not absence of sound. It is attended silence, a quiet that has something in it that is choosing to be quiet. I am not going to tell you what to do with that. What I will tell you is that when I encountered it in the Presque Isle drainage, it was real, and it had a memory longer than most memories I have known, and it stood in front of a trail camera at 11:43 on a July night in 2017 for 46 seconds, facing the lens, because it wanted to be found by whoever had put that camera there. And what we found in each other in the years that followed was not a mystery and not a danger. It was something I have no single word for, which bothered me for a long time, and no longer does, because some things sit outside the vocabulary I have available, and the absence of the word does not diminish the thing. What I have come back to, in the years since I retired, is this. He was in that drainage before I arrived in Gogabit County, and he will be in it after every trace of my career there is gone into the forest floor. The 38 years I spent in the Ottawa were the period of our overlap, and out of that overlap came what it came to. I came to the Presque Isle drainage as a young officer who did not know what was in it, and by the time I left I knew one thing that most people who have worked in the northern forest will not know, which is what it means to be recognized by something that has been alive much longer than you have and has chosen, out of all the territory it occupies and all the people who move through it without ever being seen, to let you see it. That is not a small thing to carry. It is, in the honest accounting, the most significant thing I brought home from 38 years in that forest, and I'm still working out what it means, which seems right. Some things should take a long time. The cable is in the drawer, the notebook is in the drawer, the pond is in the drainage, in the Ottawa National Forest, in Gogabit County, Michigan, under the August light that comes through the birch and falls on the water and catches the surface and makes it bright, the way light does in the places where nothing much has changed for a very long time, and the forest goes on being what it is, regardless of what anyone thinks of it or writes about it or believes. That is what I have to tell you. That is all of it.